Hello, everyone. We are a mining consultancy that has provided independent professional advice to mining companies, providers of capital, law firms, and government agencies for over 30 years. Staffed by senior industry consultants with extensive international experience, we are here to discuss relevant topics for the benefit of our mineral industry followers. And now, here is your host, Micon's Mineral Resource Specialist, Alan San Martin.
Hello, everyone. I am Alan San Martin, your host at Micon Insights. Welcome to our podcast. Here, you get to hear from our experts informative and engaging discussions to learn more about our capabilities. Before we begin, here is our sustainability statement. At Micon, we work with our clients to promote responsible mining and to integrate the principles of sustainability into their mining projects. The topic for today, it is technical and economic evaluation of mineral deposits. We are streaming on YouTube Live today, and for those who would like to ask questions, please type the questions on the chat, and we will be answering at the end of the show. I'm here today with my co-host and colleague, Bill Lewis. Bill is a senior geologist and director of Micon based in our Toronto office. Hello, Bill. How are you today? Welcome back to the show.
Thank you, Alan. I'm very well today.
Great. I'm happy to share with you another episode, and let's dive into the topic. And maybe we can start by asking you, what are the types of economic evaluations in mineral deposits?
Okay, there are three types of economic evaluations for mineral deposits, and it's customary, though not mandatory, for the evaluation of the technical and feasibility and economic viability for any given mineral deposit to proceed through these three stages. So, and they're progressively more rigorous as you advance. So the first one is a preliminary economic assessment or scoping study. The second one is a preliminary feasibility study, and the final one and highest, most rigorous one is a feasibility study.
Okay, and who does these economic evaluations?
The economic evaluations are done by QPs in various mineral and social settings. So geologists, metallurgists, mining engineers, mining economists, environmentalists, social people as well. And in a senior company like Barrick or Newmont, usually they're done internally. And for sort of mid-tier and the juniors, they're done by independent qualified professionals, usually through a consulting group.
Okay. So if we start diving into the details, what is the definition of a PEA?
Okay, a preliminary economic assessment, PEA, or also referred to as a scoping study, is typically the first and least rigorous analysis of a technical feasibility and the economic viability of a proposed mining project. So it's a preliminary, and I stress preliminary, economic assessment, and it's other than a feasibility or pre-feasibility that includes an economic analysis of the potential viability of mineral resources.
So you're right. It's very preliminary, so early in the evaluation process. So what is involved in a PEA, and when do you need to do it?
Okay, so the involvement in a PEA is basically, it's much like any other economic study. It includes mining and processing plans for a mineral deposit. what typically, whether it's going to be mined by open pit or underground, preliminary mine designs, preliminary equipment requirements, what the most appropriate processing methods are. There's some metallurgical test work has been done to suggest what the recoveries are, and a general requirements of what services and infrastructure will be needed. And when you can do it is basically once you have a resource estimate, and in the case of a PEA, because it includes inferred resources, you could do it at the onset of when you have inferred resources only. But typically, a lot of companies will wait till they have not only inferred, but also indicated or even measured resources. And usually the PEA has typically an accuracy of plus or minus 30 to 40%. And it really provides a very early measure of the potential economic outlook for a mining project. And it's based on limited work, very general assumptions regarding mining, processing, and costs, for instance. And it's meant as a guide for your decisions as to whether or not you're going to expend more money advancing the projects towards a production, and also defining further work that needs to be conducted on the project. So it's a very early study, usually done once a company has sufficient resources on a project.
Okay. So once that study is conducted, then what about the pre-feasibility, and what is the difference between a pre-feasibility and a feasibility study?
Okay, well, a pre-feasibility study is a lower level confidence study than a feasibility study. So, the distinguishing feature of a pre-feasibility study is that it is the first time upon which you can base a portion of the measured and indicated resources and convert them and declare them as proven and probable reserves using the current economic projections. And it also, a pre-feasibility study, as well as a feasibility study, precludes using inferred resources. So you're not allowed to use inferred resources once you do a preliminary feasibility study or a pre-feasibility study.
Yeah.
And pre-feasibility studies, usually they include trade-off studies, so alternative mining and processing methods. And usually you try and determine what the optimum economic level of annual production is. And generally, at this point, capital and operating costs will be estimated to an accuracy of probably plus and minus 20 to 25%.
Mm-hmm.
And it's generally recognized that a positive feasibility study is usually sufficiently reliable to form the basis for significant financial decisions for the company and progressing the project towards a production decision.
Right. So discussing more about the differences, then in the next level of a feasibility study, which also we will clarify about the definitions of bankable or definitive. Can you explain more of that?
Okay, so once you've done a pre-feasibility study, some companies at that point believe that they have sufficient economic inference for the project to proceed towards a production decision. But in general, the next step is actually conducting a feasibility study. And that's the final and definitive analysis of the technical feasibility and economic viability. So a feasibility study is used generally as the basis for a production decision by the company owning the deposit. And it's usually used as the basis for securing funds from banks and other lending institutions or equity investors in order to finance the project. So, in an FS, the project and its individual components are fully defined, and sufficient engineering and design work has been completed to permit, capital expenditures and operating costs to be estimated to a level of accuracy of typical plus or minus 15%. Some people may argue and say it should be less than 10%, but generally accepted that it's plus or minus 15%. And generally, the terms bankable feasibility study or definitive feasibility study are really just sort of nonsense terms in a sense, because a feasibility study is a feasibility study. It should always be bankable, and it should always be definitive, because it is the highest type of study, economic study, that you have in the mining industry. So companies that say bankable or definitive are usually trying to put that out there to, in some ways, make their projects seem better than if it was just a feasibility study. But it's just a
like
terms that are
words
thrown out there, but
yeah.
they're not really mean anything in the real grand scheme of things, because a feasibility study is a feasibility study, because a feasibility study will address all of the topics covered in a pre-feasibility study, but in more detail. So typically, in order to achieve sort of the desired accuracy, sort of plus and minus 15% in capital and operating costs, generally means you've probably got 15% or better of the detailed project engineering completed. So, you may not have all of the required construction and operational permits or agreements with local communities or contracts for sale of the commodity to be in place.
Yeah.
But, there's has to be a reasonable commercial assurance that all of the permits will be obtained and all of the required contracts and agreements will be finalized in the normal course of business. However, things like costs of, equipment or costs of construction, you may have, idea of how much your equipment is going to cost, and you might have sort of already sort of detailed negotiations or even contracts with equipment people, for instance. Or you may know, to a large extent, who's going to supply the concrete for your foundations, for your infrastructure, and, how much tonnage is going to take to build a tailings pond, or, how much material you're going to need for your sort of pad for a heap leach pad.
Yeah.
Also, it should be noted that both a pre-feas and a feasibility study, but really applies to a feasibility study, they have a somewhat limited shelf life, because, the prices of mineral commodities, currency exchange rates, capital expenditures and operating costs are subject to change, and in some cases, the costs might be subject to steep increases, or the price of mineral commodities may change rapidly. So because all of these factors affect the economics of any proposed mining project, they may render a feasibility study out of date within like 6 months or less. So it's all, and that applies to all economic studies, but potentially a feasibility study or a pre-feasibility study more so, because they have the rigorous and material applied to them and the economics applied to them to say that this is what we've based it on, based on current projections.
Okay. So for us as Micon, what do we offer to our clients in project evaluations?
So we offer the full gamut. I mean, we do in-house, we do PEAs or scoping studies. We can do that in-house with our team. We do pre-feasibility studies pretty much in-house with our team. But by the time you get to a pre-feasibility study and feasibility study, we typically work with a number of associates, because there are specialists in tailings dams, for instance, or heap leach projects and heap leach pads. There are specialists in, social and environmental, which becomes increasingly more rigorous as you go into a PFS or an FS. So, in a lot of ways, not a lot of companies can supply totally in-house for a PFS or FS. And like Micon relies on a lot of specialty knowledge through their group of associates.
Yeah. So if we start wrapping up this, what is Micon's final word of advice for mining project evaluations?
So generally, the three types, which are again, I'll reiterate, the starting from highest to lowest, feasibility study, then a PFS, and then, the least rigorous is a scoping study or PEA. And each provides, a evaluation and a sound basis for managing the project development. So, there is a temptation in the mining industry to sort of try and fast track projects from a PEA all the way through to a feasibility study. And a lot of companies will say, oh, we've done a PEA, but it was done as rigorously as a PFS. But because there's that temptation to skip one or more steps. But realistically, you need to take step by step through the process to determine at each stage what the true economics and the true, scale of your project is going to be. Because, skipping one or more steps carries with the risk of suboptimal returns, or worse, a failure.
Yeah. Okay. All right. So to our audience that has joining us live right now, we have our first question. If we can open for questions, Bill?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Certainly.
So this is come from Array07. Thank you, Array. He's asking, does a PEA or scoping phase is also named magnitude?
I've never heard the term magnitude used
Yeah.
for a PEA or a scoping study.
Maybe in other jurisdictions, maybe there's a custom to call it that. I don't know.
Maybe in other jurisdictions, but I haven't heard the use of that term before.
Okay. Well, that was an easy question. Thank you, Ray, for your questions. Please, the time is now to ask questions. You can type them. Otherwise, we will be ending the show soon. I'll give you a few seconds.
I would reiterate,
Yes.
Alan, on the term magnitude. Is that a because I've never heard of the term before, I'm not too sure in what context it's being used.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
if our person questioning can sort of send us a follow-up question, sort of outlining in what context the term was used, maybe we would have a better answer for them.
Of course. Okay. Well, Bill, I think we don't have more questions at the moment. So thank you so much for sharing this with us today.
Okay. And if there is any other questions that people, have at a later date, please send them to us. We're always happy to answer questions from viewers and, potential clients.
Yes, of course. Yes, we will provide the information at the end of this broadcast. We are now ending the broadcast. Thank you so much for being here with us today, and have a great day.
Thank you for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to leave your comments or questions, and be sure to follow us on LinkedIn and subscribe to our newsletter so you're kept informed on future episodes.